is A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schaub. And I kind of like to describe A Darker Shade of Magic as a more adult Harry Potter, as much as I like Harry Potter. So it's about this guy named Cal, who is a blood magician, one of the last blood magicians in the world. In a world where magic has been pretty much all but forgotten. And there are parallel universes, and it's a very interesting book. So I hope you enjoy it. It's the first of the three, the first book of a trilogy. And if y'all like it, then maybe I'll end up reading all of them. So let me know down in the comments if you want more videos like this. And let's get right to it. Chapter 1: The Traveler. Kel wore a very peculiar coat. It had neither one side, which would be conventional, nor two, which would be unexpected. But it had several, which was, of course, impossible. The first thing he did whenever he stepped out of one London and into another was take off the coat and turn it inside out once or twice, or even 3 times, until he found the side he needed. Not all of them were fashionable, but they each served a purpose. There were ones that blended in, and ones that stood out, and one that served no purpose, but of which he was just particularly fond. So when Kel passed through the palace wall and into the anteroom, he took a moment to steady himself. It took its toll moving between worlds, and then shrugged out of his red, high-collared coat and turned it inside out from right to left, so that it became a simple black jacket. Well, a simple black jacket elegantly lined with silver thread and adorned with 2 gleaming columns of silver buttons. Just because he adopted a more modest palette when he was abroad, wishing neither to offend the local royalty nor to draw attention, didn't mean he had to sacrifice style. "Oh, kings," thought Kel, as he fastened the buttons on his coat. He was starting to think like Rye. On the wall behind him, he could just make out the ghosted symbols made by his passage, like a footprint in sand already fading. He'd never bothered to mark the door from this side, simply because he never went back this way. Windsor's distance from London was terribly inconvenient, considering the fact that, when traveling between worlds, Kel could only move between a place in one and the same exact place in another, which was a problem because there was no Windsor Castle a day's journey from Red London. In fact, Kel had just come through the stone wall of a courtyard belonging to a wealthy gentleman in a town called Dyson. Dyson was, on the whole, a very pleasant place. Windsor was not. Impressive, to be sure, but not pleasant. A marble counter ran against the wall, and on it a basin of water waited for him, as it always did. He rinsed his bloody hand, as well as the silver crown he'd used for passage, then slipped the cord it hung on over his head and tucked the coin back beneath his collar. In the hall beyond, he could hear the shuffle of feet, the low murmur of servants and guards. He'd chosen the anteroom specifically to avoid them. He knew very well how little the Prince Regent liked him being here, and the last thing Kel wanted was an audience, a cluster of ears and eyes and mouths reporting the details of his visit back to the throne. Above the counter and the basin hung a mirror in a gilded frame, and did not fix it, though he did take a moment to smooth the shoulders of his coat before passing through a set of doors to meet his host. The room was stiflingly warm, the windows latched despite what looked like a lovely October day, and a fire raged oppressively in the hearth. George III sat beside it, a robe dwarfing his withered frame in a tea tray untouched before his knees. George III sat beside it, a robe dwarfing his withered frame and a tea tray untouched before his knees. When Kell came in, the king gripped the edges of his chair. "Who's there?" he called out, without turning. "Robbers. Ghosts." "I don't believe ghosts would answer, Your Majesty," said Kell, announcing himself. The ailing king broke into a rotting grin. "Master Kell," he said, "you've kept me waiting." "No more than a month," Kell said, stepping forward. King George squinted his blind eyes. "It's been longer, I'm sure." "I promise it hasn't," Kell said. "Maybe not for you," said the king, "but time isn't the same for the mad and the blind." Kell smiled. The king was in good form today. It wasn't always so. He was never sure what state he'd find His Majesty in. Perhaps it had seemed like more than a month because the last time Kell visited, the king had been in one of his moods, and Kell had barely been able to calm his fraying nerves long enough to deliver his message. "Maybe it's the year that has changed," continued the king, "and not the month." "Ah, but the year is the same. And what year is that?" Kell's brow furrowed. 1819, he said. A cloud passed across King George's face, and then he simply shook his head and said, "Time," as if that one word could be to blame for everything. Sit, he added, gesturing at the room. "There must be another chair here somewhere." There wasn't. The room was shockingly sparse, and Kell was certain the doors in the hall were locked and unlocked from without, not within. The king held out a gnarled hand. They'd taken away his rings to keep him from hurting himself, and his nails were cut to nothing. "My letter," he said, and for an instant Kell saw a glimmer of George as he once was, regal. Kell patted the pockets of his coat and realized he'd forgotten to take the notes out before changing. He shrugged out of the jacket and returned it for a moment to its red self, digging through its folds until he found the envelope. When he pressed it into the king's hand, the latter fondled it and caressed the wax seal, the red throne's emblem, a chalice with a rising sun, then brought the paper to his nose and inhaled. "Roses," he said wistfully. He meant the magic. Kell never noticed the faint aromatic scent of red London clinging to his clothes. But whenever he traveled, someone invariably told him that he smelled like freshly cut flowers. Some said tulips, others stargazers, chrysanthemums, peonies. To the King of England it was always roses. Kell was glad to know it was a pleasant scent, even if he couldn't smell it. He could smell grey London, smoke, and white London, blood. But to him, red London simply smelled like home. "Open it for me," instructed the king, "but don't mar the seal." Kell did as he was told, and withdrew the contents. For once, he was grateful the king could no longer see, so he could not know how brief the letter was. his stately countenance that warred with his fragile form and his faltering voice. Go on. Cal swallowed. Greetings to His Majesty, King George III, he read, from a neighboring throne. The Queen did not refer to it as the Red Throne, or send greetings from Red London, even though the city was in fact quite crimson, thanks to the rich, pervasive light of the river, because she did not think of it that way. To her and to everyone else who inhabited only one London, there was little need to differentiate among them. When the rulers of one conversed with those of another, they simply called them others, or neighbors, or, on occasion, and particularly in regard to White London, less flattering terms. Only those few who could move among the Londons needed a way to keep them straight, and so Cal, inspired by the lost city known to all as Black London, had given each remaining capital a color. Gray for the magicless city, red for the healthy empire, white for the starving world. In truth, the cities themselves bore little resemblance to one another, and the countries around and beyond bore even less. The fact that they were all called London was its own mystery, though the prevailing theory was that one of the cities had taken the name long ago, before the doors were all sealed, and the only things allowed through were letters between kings and queens. As to which city had first laid claim to the name, none could agree. We hope to learn that you are well, continued the Queen's letter, and that the season is as fair in your city as it is in ours. Cal paused. There was nothing more save a signature. King George wrung his hands. Is that all it says? He asked. Cal hesitated. No, he said, folding the letter. That's only the beginning. He cleared his throat and began to pace as he pulled his thoughts together and put them into the Queen's voice. Thank you for asking after our family, she says. The King and I are well. Prince Rye, on the other hand, continues to impress and infuriate in equal measure, but has at least gone the month without breaking his neck or taking an unsuitable bride. Thanks be to Kel alone for keeping him from doing either or both. Kel had every intention of letting the Queen linger on his own merits, but just then the clock on the wall chimed 5, and Kel swore under his breath. He was running late. Until my next letter, he finished hurriedly. Stay happy and stay well. With fondness, Her Highness Emira, Queen of Arnes. Kel waited for the king to say something, but his blind eyes had a steady and faraway look, and Kel feared he had lost him. He set the folded note on the tea tray and was halfway to the wall when the king spoke up. I don't have a letter for her, he murmured. That's all right, said Kel softly. The king hadn't been able to write one for years. Some months he tried, dragging the quill haphazardly across the parchment, and some months he insisted on having Kel transcribe. But most months he simply told Kel the message, and Kel promised to remember. You see, I didn't have the time, added the king, trying to salvage a vestige of his dignity. Kel let him have it. I understand, he said. I'll give the royal family your regards. Kel turned again to go, and again the old king called out to stop him. Wait, he said. Come back. Kel paused. His eyes went to the clock. Late and getting later. He pictured the Prince Regent sitting at his So he turned back toward the king as the latter pulled something from his robe with fumbling fingers. It was a coin. "It's fading," said the king, cupping the metal in his weathered hands as if it were precious and fragile. "I can't feel the magic anymore. Can't smell it." "A coin is a coin, your majesty." "Not so, and you know it," grumbled the old king. "Turn out your pockets." Kel sighed. "You'll get me in trouble." Come, said the king. "Our little secret." Alright, well, that's gonna do it for today. We'll pick up from this point next time. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it starts a little slow, but what good book doesn't start off a little slow and then get better? So, thanks for coming. Please subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you think, let me know what you want to see, and, yeah, I'll see you next time.